Welcome to Historical Sleep Stories, a quiet place where forgotten worlds return softly to life. Tonight, we travel to Victorian England, to a small village in the English countryside, where the roads are narrow and the hedgerows grow tall, where the church spire rises above the rooftops and the school bell has rung every morning for 100 years. It is autumn. The leaves are turning. The air carries the first cool edge of the season to come. And in the village schoolhouse, a woman is preparing for her last day of teaching. Before we begin, settle in comfortably. Let your breathing slow. Let the sounds of your own world grow soft and distant around you. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let us begin. The village of Ashborne Crossing sat in a shallow valley in the county of Somerset, cupped between two gentle hills, like something placed there carefully by a patient hand. It was the kind of village that had existed, in more or less its current form, for several centuries. The same families on the same farms, the same church at the centre, the same market on Fridays, the same rhythms of planting and harvest and winter rest that had marked the passage of time long before anyone thought to write it down. The schoolhouse stood at the eastern edge of the village green, separated from the church by a low stone wall and a row of horse chestnut trees that were, this particular October morning, in the full glory of their autumn colour. The leaves had turned overnight, it seemed, or perhaps gradually, so gradually that no one had noticed until the change was complete. From the deep green of summer to a warm, layered cascade of amber and gold and russet that caught the morning light and held it. Inside the schoolhouse, Miss Eleanor Marsh was arranging the desks. She did this every morning, had done it every morning for 31 years, moving through the rows with the quiet attention of someone for whom the arrangement of 30 small desks was not a chore, but a ritual. Each desk needed to be straight. Each inkwell needed to be filled. Each slate needed to be clean, wiped with the damp cloth she kept folded on her own desk at the front of the room, and set in its proper place with the chalk laid beside it. Eleanor was 57 years old. She was a small woman, spare in the way that people who have spent their lives in modest circumstances often are, not thin from want, but lean from habit, from the natural result of a life spent in purposeful motion. Her hair, which had been a warm dark brown when she first arrived in Ashborne Crossing as a young woman of 26, was now almost entirely grey, worn in the same neat arrangement it had always been, pinned at the back of her neck with the same tortoise-shell comb she had received from her mother on the occasion of her first teaching post. The schoolhouse smelled, as it always did, of chalk dust and wood polish and the particular papery smell of books that have been read many times by many different hands. Eleanor had grown so accustomed to this smell over the decades that she no longer consciously registered it. It was simply the smell of being here, of being in this room, which was in many ways more truly her home than the small cottage 2 streets away, where she slept and kept her few possessions. She had come to Ashborne Crossing in the autumn of 1851, the year she turned 26, newly certificated from the training college in Bristol, and full of the particular combination of enthusiasm and anxiety that young teachers carry into their first classrooms. The village had seemed very small to her then, coming as she did from the city, and the schoolhouse had seemed very quiet. She had wondered, in those first weeks, whether she had made the right decision, whether this remote valley, this small stone building, this collection of children whose lives were entirely bounded by the hills and fields around them, was truly where she was meant to be. She had stopped wondering within the year. There was something about teaching that she had not fully understood until she began to do it, something that her training had described but could not convey. The way a child's face changed when something became clear to them, when the letters on a page stopped being strange marks and became words, when the numbers stopped being abstract and began to mean something. The particular quality of attention that children brought to a new idea, the wholeness of it, the way they gave themselves entirely to understanding in a way that adults, with their accumulated habits and defenses, rarely could. She had loved it from the beginning. She loved it still. This morning, however, was different from all the mornings that had preceded it. This morning was her last. The letter from the school board had arrived 3 weeks ago. It was politely worded, as such letters always were, full of expressions of gratitude for her long service, of acknowledgement of her contribution to the village, of carefully phrased regret that the new regulations regarding teacher qualifications would require the appointment of a certificated master in place of the village schoolmistress, who had, the board acknowledged, served the community with great distinction. Eleanor had read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. She had not cried. She was not, by temperament, a woman who cried easily. But she had sat for a long time in the quiet of her cottage, looking out at the garden where the last of the summer's roses were fading on their stems, and she had felt something that she had no precise word for, a weight, not quite grief, not quite anger, something that sat between them and shared qualities of both. She was being replaced, after 31 years, because of new regulations that valued a certificate over 3 decades of devoted daily work. She understood the reasoning, or at least she could follow the logic of it. The world was changing. Education was becoming more formal, more systematized, more concerned with credentials and examinations and the measurable outputs of learning. These were not, in themselves, bad things. She believed in education too deeply to oppose its expansion, but she also knew what would be lost. She knew the names of the children in this village going back 3 generations. She knew which families struggled and which were comfortable, which children needed patience and which needed challenge, which would flourish if encouraged and which would retreat if pushed. She carried this knowledge in her, accumulated over 30 years, and it would not transfer to a certificate. It could not be written down. It existed only in the ongoing relationship between a teacher and the community she served, and it would end when she left. She straightened the last desk and stood for a moment in the quiet room, looking at the rows of small seats, the blackboard at the front with its chalk residue, the maps on the wall that she had bought with her own money 20 years ago, when the ones provided by the board had become too faded to read, the shelf of readers along the back wall that she had carefully mended and remended over the years so that they might last a few more terms. The bell in the church tower began to ring. 8 o'clock. The children would arrive in 20 minutes. Eleanor went to her desk and sat down. She had prepared last night. what she intended to say to them, the children, who knew that today was her last day, who had been informed by their parents with varying degrees of tact and care. She had thought about it carefully, the way she thought about all her lessons, working out what she wanted them to understand and how best to give it to them in terms they could hold on to. She wanted them to know that learning did not end when school ended, that the ability to read, once acquired, was a door that stayed open forever, and that what mattered was not where they had learned to read, but that they had learned, and what they chose to do with it. She wanted them to know that she had been grateful, was grateful, would remain grateful for the rest of her life, for every morning she had spent in this room with them. She was still composing her thoughts when she heard the gate in the stone wall open, and then the sound of small feet on the path, and then the door, and then they began to come in. They came in quietly, which was unusual. The children of Ashborne Crossing were not, as a rule, a quiet group. They were village children, outdoor children, accustomed to the space and noise of the fields and lanes, and they brought that energy with them into the schoolhouse in ways that Eleanor had spent years learning to channel rather than suppress. But this morning they came in quietly, one by one, and in small groups, and they took their places at their desks without being asked, and they looked at her. She looked back at them. There were 23 of them this morning, ranging in age from 5-year-old Thomas Hewitt, who had started in September and still sometimes fell asleep at his desk in the afternoon, to 14-year-old Sarah Cooper, who would leave school herself at the end of term to help on her family's farm, and who had, over the past 2 years, become the kind of reader that Eleanor had hoped she would become, a person for whom books were a genuine source of pleasure and sustenance, not merely a school exercise to be endured. At the back of the room, slightly apart from the others, sat a boy Eleanor had not seen before. He was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, dark-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who is trying very hard not to be noticed. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of careful cleanliness that speaks of limited means and considerable effort. He sat at the desk that had been empty since James Alderton moved away in the summer, and he looked at the surface of it rather than at Eleanor, and he had the quality that she had learned over 30 years to recognize immediately, the quality of someone who was not sure whether they were welcome. Eleanor finished calling the register, noting the unfamiliar name she had added last evening at the request of a note delivered to her cottage by the village constable. Thomas Hartley, arrived 2 days ago, staying at the inn until arrangements could be made. No family in the village that anyone knew of. She looked at the boy. He looked up, met her gaze for a moment, and then looked down again. Eleanor set down her register and said, in the same tone she used for everything, warm but matter-of-fact, the tone that said, "This is simply how things are, and there is nothing to be afraid of. Good morning, Thomas. We are glad you are here." The boy looked up again. His expression was careful, still guarded, the expression of someone who has learned that kindness sometimes has conditions attached to it. "Good morning, miss," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. "We will begin," Eleanor said, turning to the blackboard, "with reading." And so the last day began. The morning passed in the way that good mornings in classrooms always pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular texture of time that comes when people are engaged in something that matters. Eleanor moved through the room as she always did, pausing here to listen to a child read aloud, there to correct a line of writing, elsewhere to answer a question or offer an encouragement, or simply to stand for a moment beside a desk where a child was working and let her presence be, in itself, a form of support. She paused longest at Thomas Hartley's desk. He was working on his letters. She had assessed him quickly during the reading session and found him to be at roughly the level of a 7-year-old in his literacy, though his face and manner suggested he was considerably older. This was not unusual. Children who moved around, who had irregular schooling or none at all, often came to her with significant gaps in their learning, and she had long since stopped treating such gaps as deficiencies to be ashamed of, and had learned instead to regard them simply as the place where the teaching needed to begin. He was copying the letters from the board with considerable care. His handwriting, though unpracticed, was deliberate and neat, the handwriting of someone who understood the importance of taking care with things, even things he was not yet skilled at. "You hold your pen well," she said quietly, standing beside him. He looked up. "My mother showed me," he said. And then, as though the sentence had surprised him on his way out, he looked back down at his work. Eleanor said nothing more. She moved on to the next desk, but she noted the sentence, the past tense of it, the way it sat in the air after he spoke, and she understood something that she had suspected from the moment she saw him sitting alone with his careful stillness. At midday, she released the children for their dinner hour. Most of them went home. The village was small enough that almost all of them lived within a few minutes' walk. A few stayed, as they sometimes did, eating whatever they had brought from home on the steps of the schoolhouse in the thin autumn sunshine. Thomas Hartley stayed. He sat on the bottom step with his hands in his lap, and he did not appear to have brought anything to eat. Eleanor went to her cottage, which was close enough to the school that she could be back within 10 minutes, and she made 2 cups of tea and cut 2 slices of bread and spread them with butter and the last of the blackcurrant jam she had put up in August. She carried them back on a tray and set one portion beside the boy without comment, as though this was simply the natural order of things and required no explanation. He looked at the bread and tea for a moment. "Thank you, miss," he said. "You're welcome, Thomas." She sat on the step beside him, which was not something she usually did, and they ate in companionable silence, looking out at the village green where the horse chestnut leaves were beginning to drift down in the light wind, turning slowly as they fell, catching the pale October light. After a while, without being asked, Thomas said, "How long have you been the teacher here?" 31 years, Eleanor said. He considered this. "That's a long time." "It is. Do you like it?" She looked at him. This serious, careful boy with his mother's past tense hanging unspoken between them. "Very much," she said. "It has been the great work of my life." He nodded slowly, as though this was an answer he could understand. The bell in the church tower began to ring the half-hour. "We should go back in," Eleanor said. They went back in. "Rest now. Let the story settle gently around you. like autumn leaves drifting to still ground. The schoolhouse is warm. The children are at their desks. Outside, the horse chestnut leaves are turning gold. There is nothing required of you but stillness. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. The story will continue when you are ready. The afternoon session began with arithmetic. Eleanor wrote the sums on the blackboard with the steady, unhurried hand of someone for whom the chalk was an extension of her own thinking. Numbers appearing in neat rows, each one placed with care, each problem selected with the particular child in mind who would most benefit from attempting it. She had always believed that arithmetic, taught well, was not merely the manipulation of numbers, but the practice of a certain kind of thinking, careful, sequential, honest in its demands. Numbers did not lie. A sum was either right or wrong, and the path to rightness required patience and attention, which were, she had always thought, among the most useful qualities a person could develop. Thomas Hartley looked at the board with the expression of someone encountering a foreign language. Eleanor noticed. She always noticed. After 31 years, the classroom had become a kind of extension of her senses. She was aware at any given moment of the quality of attention at every desk, of which children were engaged and which were struggling, of the particular kind of stillness that indicated understanding and the different kind that indicated confusion. She moved to his desk quietly, without drawing the attention of the other children, and set beside him a small piece of paper on which she had written the simplest of the sums in larger numbers, with a note beside it that said, in her clear, precise hand, "Begin here." He looked at the paper. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, the guardedness easing fractionally, the way a door opens just enough to let in a sliver of light. He picked up his chalk and began. The afternoon wore on. The light through the schoolhouse windows changed as the sun moved, shifting from the bright directness of midday to the softer, more angled quality of autumn afternoon, the kind of light that seems to come from a lower and more intimate place, and that turns everything it touches, the desks, the children's bent heads, the dust motes floating in the warm air, into something that looks, briefly, like it has been arranged for a painting. Eleanor moved through the room. She listened and corrected and encouraged. She helped young Thomas Hewitt, who had fallen asleep again with his head on his arms, back to wakefulness with a gentle touch on his shoulder and the offer of a simpler task that might hold his attention through the last hour of the day. She spent a few minutes with Sarah Cooper, looking over the essay Sarah had written the previous day on the subject of the seasons, which was, for a 14-year-old from a farming village, a remarkably perceptive piece of work, full of the kind of precise, grounded observation that comes from someone who has spent her whole life paying close attention to the natural world. "This is very good, Sarah," Eleanor said quietly. Sarah looked up, and her expression contained the particular combination of pleasure and embarrassment that genuine praise produces in people who are not quite used to receiving it. "Thank you, miss." "You should continue to write," Eleanor said. "Whatever else happens, keep writing. It is how you think." Sarah looked at her for a moment. "Will you be going away, miss, after today?" "I will stay in the village," Eleanor said. "I'm not going anywhere." "But you won't be here." Sarah's gesture took in the room. The desks, the blackboard, the maps on the walls, all of it. No, Eleanor said. Not here. But I will be in the village. And if you ever want to talk about a book or show me something you have written, you may come and find me. The door of my cottage is always open. Sarah nodded and looked back at her essay, and Eleanor moved on. At 3:30, the church bell rang the end of the school day. The children began to gather their things, their slates and chalks, the lunch cloths that some of them had brought, the various small items that accumulated in desks over the course of a day. There was the usual noise of movement, the scrape of benches, the voices rising as the formal constraint of the school day lifted. But there was something different today, an undercurrent, a consciousness that this was not an ordinary ending. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and waited. Gradually, the noise settled. The children looked at her, and she looked at them. And for a moment, the room was very quiet. "Before you go," she said, and her voice was steady, the voice she had used every day for 31 years, the voice that conveyed that what was being said mattered and deserved attention. "I want to say something." She paused. She had planned what she would say. She had rehearsed it in the quiet of her cottage the night before, until the words came naturally. But standing here now, looking at their faces, Thomas Hewitt's round, sleepy face, Sarah Cooper's attentive gaze, the middle children ranged between them, and at the back, Thomas Hartley, with his careful stillness, she found that the words she had prepared were not quite right. They were true, but they were not sufficient. They said what she wanted to say, but not how she wanted to say it. She began again from somewhere closer to the truth. 31 years ago, she said, I walked into this room for the first time. I was 26 years old, and I was frightened, though I tried not to show it. There were 32 children sitting where you sit now, different children, most of them grown up with families of their own, but sitting in these same desks, looking at me with the same expressions you have now. She paused. A few of the children smiled. I want you to know something about that day, she said. I want you to know that on that day, I did not know if I was capable of doing what I had come to do. I had been trained for it. I had my certificate. But I did not know if I had. She searched for the word, the steadiness for it, the patience, the willingness to come back every day, year after year, and begin again. She looked at them. 23 faces turned toward her. I found that I did, she said simply. And the reason I found it, the reason I was able to come back every morning for 31 years and be glad that I had come, was you. Not any single one of you, but all of you. All the children who have sat in these desks, who have shown me what it looks like when a person learns something for the first time. There is nothing in the world quite like that. I have been fortunate enough to see it thousands of times. It has never once seemed ordinary. The room was very still. What I want to leave with you, she continued, is this. The reading you have learned here, the arithmetic, the writing, the history, and the geography, these are not things that belong to school. They belong to you. You will carry them with you for the rest of your lives, and they will serve you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Use them. Read whenever you can. Write when you have something to say. Think carefully about the world and your place in it. She looked at them one more time, at all of them, holding each face for a moment in her gaze. "It has been the honor of my life to be your teacher," she said. "Now go home." For a moment, no one moved. And then Sarah Cooper stood up, and the other children stood up, and they filed out into the afternoon. Quietly, not with the usual rush and noise of dismissal, but with something more considered, more deliberate, as though they understood, or were beginning to understand, that something was ending that would not come again. Eleanor stood at the front of the empty room and listened to their footsteps fade. Thomas Hartley was the last to leave. He stood at the door for a moment, his cap in his hands, looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "Miss," he said. "Yes, Thomas." "Will you still be here tomorrow?" "I will be in the village," she said. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. He seemed to be considering something. Then he said, very quietly, "My mother was a teacher." Eleanor looked at him. She had understood this already, or something close to it. The past tense, the careful handwriting, the quality of attention he brought to the books she had set before him in the afternoon, as though they were things to be treated with particular respect. "Was she?" Eleanor said. Not a question, a recognition. "She died in the spring," he said. "We were in Bristol. There wasn't anyone." He stopped. "The constable said there was a school here. He said they might take me in." He said it simply, without self-pity, the way he had said everything, with the directness of someone who has learned that clarity is safer than ambiguity, that it is better to say a thing plainly than to hope it will be understood. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the children had gone. The village green was empty in the afternoon light, the horse chestnut leaves still drifting down one by one in the still autumn air. The church bell had fallen silent. From somewhere across the green, the sound of someone calling a name, a door closing, the ordinary sounds of a village settling into its afternoon. "Come with me," she said. He looked at her. "You have not eaten since midday," she said, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. "And I have not yet had my tea. Come." He came. They walked together across the village green, through the drifting chestnut leaves, past the church and the low stone wall, to the cottage at the end of the lane where Eleanor had lived for 31 years. She opened the door and he followed her inside. The cottage was small and neat and full of books, books on shelves along every wall, books stacked on the table, books on the windowsill, a particular kind of domestic landscape that spoke of someone for whom reading was not a hobby but a necessity, as fundamental to daily life as eating or sleeping. Thomas Hartley stood in the doorway of the cottage and looked at the books. His expression changed. Something in his face opened, the guardedness falling away entirely, replaced by something that Eleanor recognized immediately because she had spent 31 years watching for it. The look of someone encountering for the first time a place that might be home. She put the kettle on. "Rest now. The cottage is warm. The kettle is on. Outside, the autumn afternoon is settling into evening, the light going golden across the village green, the chestnut leaves drifting in the still air. You are warm. You are safe. There is nothing required of you. Let the story hold you gently. Let your breathing slow. Simply rest. The kettle sang on the hob, a small domestic sound that filled the cottage with the particular warmth of things that are ordinary and reliable. Eleanor moved about the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is without needing to look. The cups on their hooks, the tea caddy on the shelf above the stove, the sugar bowl on the windowsill, beside the small pot of rosemary. She grew there for the light. Thomas Hartley stood in the doorway between the hall and the sitting room, not quite entering, not quite leaving. He was looking at the books. Eleanor was aware of him looking. She said nothing about it. She had learned, over 31 years, that there were moments when the most useful thing a person could do was simply to continue with what they were doing and allow the other person to settle in their own time. Rushing the process, filling the silence with words, demanding attention or response, was almost always counterproductive. People arrived at ease when they were ready. You could not hurry them. She poured the water into the pot and set it to steep and cut 2 slices of the brown bread she had baked 2 days ago. There was butter and a piece of the cheddar she bought from the farm at the end of the lane, and she put these on a plate and carried it to the table and set it down. "Come and sit," she said. He came and sat. He sat at the table with the same careful posture he had maintained all day, straight back, hands folded, as though he had been taught that sitting correctly was a form of courtesy to the people around him. His mother's teaching, she thought. A mother who had been a teacher herself, who had understood that these small habits of body and manner were not mere formality, but the outward expression of a quality of attention, a way of being present in the world. She poured the tea and sat across from him, and they ate in the same companionable silence they had shared on the schoolhouse steps at midday. And it occurred to Eleanor that silence with this boy was not uncomfortable. He did not fill it with noise the way some children did, driven by nervousness or the need for approval. He simply sat in it, and the quality of his sitting was, itself, a kind of conversation. After a while, she said, "Tell me about your mother." He looked up. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. Then, carefully, as though choosing each word from a small and precious supply, he began to speak. Her name had been Catherine. She had trained as a teacher in London, at a college on the Strand, and had taught for several years at a school in Lambeth before she married his father. His father had been a clerk, a quiet, steady man, Thomas said, though he said it with the slight uncertainty of someone describing something only half remembered, a figure at the edge of his recollection, rather than its centre. His father had died when Thomas was 4 years old, of a fever that came on quickly and did not relent. After that, it had been just the two of them. His mother had not been able to return to teaching in a formal capacity. The regulations were, as Eleanor knew, more complex for married women and widows than for single women, and the schools in the areas where they had lived had not always had positions available. But she had taught privately, taking in children whose parents could pay a modest sum for lessons, conducting her small school in the front room of whatever lodging they occupied, and supplementing this income with copying work and the occasional piece of translation, for she had French and a little Italian. They had moved several times, Bristol, then Bath, then back to Bristol, each move prompted by the calculus of opportunity and expense that shaped the lives of people managing on very little. Cheaper rooms elsewhere, the possibility of more pupils, the occasional improvement in circumstances that turned out to be less significant than hoped. Thomas described these moves without complaint and without the resignation that sometimes settles on children who have had difficult lives. He described them as simply the geography of his childhood, the landscape through which he and his mother had moved together, making the best of what was available. In Bristol, in the spring just past, his mother had grown ill. It had begun as a cough, the kind of persistent winter cough that was common in the damp of city lodgings, that many people carried for months and then shed with the coming of warmer weather. But this cough had not shed. It had deepened through February and into March, settling into something that the doctor, when he finally came, called a congestion of the lungs. She had continued to teach as long as she could, sitting in the chair by the window when she no longer had the strength to stand, directing her small class of pupils with the same composed attention that she had always brought to teaching, pausing occasionally to rest her voice. She had died in April, on a morning when the apple tree outside their window was in blossom and the light was the particular clear gold of early spring. Thomas told this without tears. He had the manner of someone who has already done his grieving, who has passed through the acute phase of it and arrived somewhere quieter, a landscape of simple fact in which the loss is present everywhere, but no longer overwhelming. Eleanor recognized this. She had seen it before, in children who had lost parents young, who had had to find a way to carry the loss because there was no alternative. The loss did not diminish, but they learned to walk with it. When he finished, the cottage was quiet. Outside, the light had shifted to the low amber of late afternoon. A blackbird was singing somewhere in the garden, its song unhurried and clear. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother sounds like someone I would have been glad to know." Thomas looked at her. Something in his face, some last residual tension, released. "She would have liked you too," he said. "She liked people who were serious about teaching." Eleanor felt the warmth of this, the particular warmth of being seen clearly by someone who has no reason to flatter. "That is a fine thing to say," she told him. He nodded. He looked down at his cup, turning it slightly in his hands. "What happens now?" he asked. "To me?" It was a practical question, asked practically, without drama. What happens now? As though he were inquiring about the next item on a list, the next step in a process that was already underway and simply needed to be understood. Eleanor had been thinking about this since the moment he had appeared at the door of the schoolhouse that morning. She had been thinking about it through the day, turning it over alongside everything else. The last lessons, the final register, the words she had spoken to the children before they left. And she had arrived by the time the afternoon had turned to evening and the boy was sitting at her kitchen table eating bread and cheese, at a conclusion that seemed, the more she considered it, not a decision at all, but simply the recognition of something that was already true. "I have a spare room," she said. "It's not large. There is a bed and a chest of drawers and a window that looks out onto the garden. The apple tree is visible from it. which I have always thought was pleasant in the spring. Thomas was very still. The village will need to be consulted, Eleanor continued. There are arrangements to be made and people to be spoken to, and I cannot promise that every detail will resolve itself easily. But those are practical matters, and practical matters can generally be resolved if one is patient and persistent. She looked at him steadily. What I can tell you now, she said, is that you are not going anywhere tonight, and I do not think you should be alone. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were bright, but he did not cry. He had, Eleanor thought, his mother's steadiness, the particular quality of people who have learned that emotions, however deep, are most safely felt quietly, in the private space of the self, rather than spilled into the world where they become someone else's problem to manage. "Thank you," he said, the same words he had said at midday on the schoolhouse steps, but said differently now, with more weight, with the particular gravity of someone who understands what they are thanking someone for. Eleanor nodded. She stood and took the cups to the sink and began to wash them in the practical, unhurried way she did everything. In the weeks that followed, the practical matters resolved themselves in the way that Eleanor had promised they would, slowly, not without difficulty, but steadily and in the right direction. The village constable was spoken to. The school board, which had already demonstrated its capacity for bureaucratic process, proved equally capable of the bureaucratic process required to establish a guardianship arrangement, which it did after several letters and 2 formal meetings, at which Eleanor presented her case with the same quiet, unadorned clarity she brought to everything. The vicar was consulted and gave his blessing. Mrs. Alderton, who ran the post office and whose opinion carried considerable weight in Ashborne Crossing, declared that it was exactly the right thing to do, and that anyone who thought otherwise was welcome to explain themselves to her, which appeared to resolve the matter of community opinion decisively. Thomas Hartley moved his small collection of belongings from the inn into the room at the top of the stairs in Eleanor's cottage. His belongings were very few: a change of clothes, a small wooden box that he did not open in front of her and that she did not ask about, and a book. The book was a copy of a collection of poetry, small and worn, its cover held together by a piece of ribbon that had been tied around it many times and was beginning to fray. He set it on the windowsill beside the apple tree view, and Eleanor understood that this was the thing he had carried with him from his mother's life, the thing that had survived the moves and the loss and the long, uncertain weeks since April. She did not ask about the book, but one evening, perhaps 3 weeks after he had come to stay, she came upstairs to tell him that supper was ready and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, reading it, his lips moving slightly, the way children's lips move when they are reading something they care about, giving the words a little breath. She said nothing. She went back downstairs and put the pot on the back of the stove to keep warm and waited. He came down 10 minutes later and they ate together in the easy quiet that had become, without either of them formally deciding it, the texture of their evenings. After supper, he said, "It's poems." "Is it?" Eleanor said. "My mother's. She wrote some of them in the margins." He paused. "I can't always read her writing. It's very small." Bring it downstairs sometime, Eleanor said, if you would like another pair of eyes. He looked at her. All right, he said. He brought it the following evening. They sat on either side of the fire, the lamp between them, and Eleanor read the marginal notes in Catherine Hartley's small, precise hand, while Thomas watched her face to see what she made of them. They were observations, mostly, brief responses to the poems, the kind of notes a teacher might make for her own use, tracking the places where the language had caught her attention. A few were more personal, a line that she had underscored twice with particular care, beside which she had written simply, "Remember this." Eleanor read them all. She read them with the attention they deserved, which was the same attention she had always given to anything written. The belief that if someone had taken the trouble to put words on a page, those words deserved to be read properly. When she had finished, she handed the book back to Thomas. She read carefully, Eleanor said. She said that was the only way to read, Thomas replied. Eleanor smiled. She was right. He looked at the book in his hands, then up at her. "Will you teach me?" he said. "The things she would have taught me. If she had—" He stopped. "If she had lived," Eleanor said gently. He nodded. Eleanor looked at him. This boy with his mother's steadiness and his mother's careful handwriting and his mother's dog-eared book of poems, and felt something that she had not expected to feel again. Something she had thought was behind her, the particular quality of purpose that teaching had always given her. The sense of standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. "Yes," she said, "I will teach you." And so a new kind of school began, smaller than the one that had ended, conducted at the kitchen table and by the evening fire rather than in the schoolhouse on the green, but no less real for that. Thomas was a willing student and a quick one, and the gaps in his education, which had seemed daunting at first, proved to close faster than expected when they were addressed with sustained attention and without the competing demands of a full classroom. He read, he wrote, he worked through the arithmetic with the dogged patience that his mother appeared to have instilled in him, accepting that not every step came easily, and that the ones that required effort were, when finally understood, the ones most solidly known. He also gradually began to speak more freely, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the evenings, sitting by the fire while the autumn deepened into winter and the first frost came and the apple tree in the garden stood bare against the cold sky. He began to tell her things about his mother, about the places they had lived, about the small schoolroom in Bristol where Catherine Hartley had taught her handful of pupils in the years before she became ill. He told these stories in the same measured, careful way he told everything, but there was less guardedness in the telling now, less of the sense that he was monitoring his words for safety. He had begun, Eleanor thought, to trust the ground beneath him. Winter settled over Ashborne Crossing with its usual thoroughness. Snow came in December, soft and persistent, covering the village green and the rooftops and the stone wall beside the schoolhouse where the new teacher, a young man from Bristol with his certificate and his enthusiasm and his genuine, if inexperienced kindness, had hung a small bell to summon his pupils each morning. Eleanor watched the new school begin with an equanimity that surprised even herself. She had expected to find it painful, the sight of someone else standing at the blackboard she had stood at for 31 years, the sound of someone else's voice carrying through the village in the mornings. And there were moments when something tightened in her chest, when she passed the schoolhouse and heard the children inside. But there were also moments when she looked at the new teacher through the window and saw something that pleased her, a quality of attention, a willingness to be patient, the beginning of what might, in time, become the thing she had spent her life trying to be. One morning, in early December, she encountered him on the village green. He was young, perhaps 25, and he had the slightly overwhelmed quality of someone who has recently discovered that the thing they trained for is considerably more complex than the training suggested. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I have been hoping to speak with you." "Have you?" she said. "I wondered." He hesitated. "I have a boy in my class, Thomas Hartley. He is considerably behind the others in some respects, and I am not entirely sure how best to—" He stopped again, looking uncertain. "He is not behind," Eleanor said. "He is differently placed. There is a distinction." She paused. "He responds well to patience and to being trusted with difficult material once the foundations are secure. He does not need to be rushed. He will arrive where he needs to be." The young teacher looked at her with an expression of gratitude that was also, she thought, relief. The relief of someone who has been given a direction when they were not sure which way to go. "Thank you," he said. "I wonder if I might, that is, if you would be willing to speak with me sometimes, about the children, about the village." He looked slightly embarrassed. "I am new here. There is much I don't know." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. The morning light was clear and cold, the snow on the green unmarked, the church spire sharp against the pale winter sky. "Come to tea on Thursday," she said. "Bring your questions." He smiled, a young man's smile, open and grateful. "I will. Thank you, Miss Marsh." She walked home through the snow, and the tightness in her chest had eased. That evening, she told Thomas about the conversation. He listened with his usual attention, his cup warming his hands, his eyes on the fire. "So, you're still teaching," he said. "In a different way," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at her with the directness that had always characterized him, the quality of seeing things clearly and without evasion. "My mother used to say that teaching never really stops," he said. "She said it just changes shape." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, soft and silent, settling on the garden and the apple tree and the lane beyond the gate. "Your mother," she said, "was a very wise woman." Thomas looked at the fire. In the glow of it, his face was young and peaceful. The careful stillness that had defined him when he first arrived now transformed into something quieter, something more at rest. "She was," he said simply. They sat together in the warmth of the cottage as the snow fell outside and the fire burned low and the evening deepened into night. Two people who had found each other at the end of one thing and the beginning of another, in the middle of an ordinary autumn in a small English village where the horse chestnut leaves had turned gold and the school bell still rang every morning and the blackbird in the garden sang its unhurried song. The lamp burned steadily between them. The snow continued to fall, and in the cottage at the end of the lane in Ashborne Crossing, all was quietly, gently well. Sleep now. The snow is falling on Ashborne Crossing. The village is still. The schoolhouse on the green is dark, its day's work done. And in the cottage at the end of the lane, a lamp burns in the window, warm and steady against the winter dark. Two people sit by a fire that is burning low, and neither of them speaks, and neither of them needs to. You have been here with them. You know this place now, the smell of the cottage, the sound of the snow, the warmth of the fire, the particular quiet of an evening when everything is as it should be. Let it go now. Let it drift. You are safe. You are warm. The night is long and still, and entirely yours. Good night. This has been Historical Sleep Stories. We will be here again tomorrow night with another story, another place, and another quiet journey into the past. Until then, sleep well.